Thank you so much for joining us. We have got an action-packed 45 minutes coming up for you. We've got our three excellent, very knowledgeable speakers here from Brookfield Asset Management, Schneider Electric, and from WSP. And they're going to tell you about how they've come together to develop a new methodology to really guide you through that process of how to decarbonize your whole building portfolio. So I'm going to be your host for this session. My name's Kate Doherty. I'm head of net zero for building services at WSP UK. And with that, I think I'll invite our wonderful panel to introduce themselves. So Alex, let's start with you.
Thanks, Kate. So Alex Wolfson, I'm head of ESG management for Brookfield's real estate European portfolio. It's consisted of over 40 billion of asset under management.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. Matt?
Thanks, Kate. So my name is Matt Proctor. I am a Global Strategic Account Executive at Schneider Electric, based here in the UK also.
Super. And Jay?
Hey, everybody. This is Jay Ratton. I lead our Market Innovation and Advisory Services practice in the United States.
Thank you so much, everyone. Right, before we kick off, we're all going to get our heads into gear with a bit of a quick poll. If we can just get that up on the screen. Thank you. Super. So, thinking about your own company or the clients that you work with, where are you or your clients on this decarbonisation journey? And look, that can be anywhere from, I don't even know where to start, to we've got a plan, but it's a real challenge getting started. Or, you know, we've implemented our plan and we're starting to see the results. So let me just leave that up for another few seconds. I don't know what all you can see, but I can't see any results, unfortunately. Right, can we take, okay. Oh, actually I can see some results now. That's wonderful. Wow, a real mixed bag that we've got there in terms of those poll answers. So I think that really shows that we are in a transition period at the moment. Everyone's very much in a different place, and I'm sure we've got lots to learn from each other because of that. So that's a really great point, I think, to kick off from what we're going to talk about today. So, you know, you all know in our world of property and buildings, our engagement with the climate crisis is changing rapidly. And with that, of course, so are the expectations of the stakeholders in the commercial real estate market. Sustainability, wellness, resilience, these things have all become really important to the valuation of building assets, and as a knock-on, of course, to investment strategies as well. So look, we know that to tackle the climate crisis and also ensure that future profitability, it really is so important that we look to upgrade our existing building stock to meet all these needs. But there's lots of challenges in retrofit, particularly in commercial real estate. I'm thinking about disruption to tenants, balancing some of those competing priorities, upskilling our internal facilities teams, and for sure, like measuring, setting, and verifying those carbon targets. So decarbonisation at this scale, I think it really can begin to sound quite overwhelming when we think of all that, but fear not. The team that we've got here today have developed a really clear methodology that I think really cuts through the complexity of all of this. But just before we get into the real detail of that methodology, I'm actually going to ask you, Alex, to come in here and give us a bit of your take on some of the specific challenges that Brookfield have faced around this.
Definitely. Thanks, Kate. So yeah, a few years ago, we started collecting energy data for our various investments. It was mainly driven by Brookfield's commitment to the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative to become net zero by 2050. And simultaneously, we started reporting to GRESB for a number of our funds. Here's where we faced our first challenge, which was data collection. We quickly realized that data collection is not straightforward, and it is incredibly difficult to ensure the accuracy and completeness of it. So we started relying on data being just consistent. We noticed that not always our investments manage the data, and that tenant energy usage or waste volumes are often unavailable. So automation of data is paramount. If we want to define robust and achievable net zero pathways, we first need complete, accurate, and timely data to understand where our assets stand. The second challenge is related to size. So our portfolio consists of over 500 buildings across a range of assets, types, and locations for just our European fund. That means that designing modernization plans on a property-by-property basis is not realistic from a cost-time perspective, and that we need to tackle it more holistically through logical grouping of assets. Then a question raised on our end: how do we approach modernization plans on buildings that are closer to the end of the investment cycle, and we have little or no CapEx budget available? We need to also consider materiality in this case. We're rolling out achievable plans. It is not realistic wanting to apply the same formula for all assets. So for us, one important factor is that decarbonization plans must create value that is quantifiable, bringing returns on interventions. If we can generate an increase in valuations and IRRs, we cannot modernize our portfolio of such significance. I mean, good luck convincing any portfolio management team to invest vast amounts in interventions without a value creation model supporting this. And lastly, when modernizing our portfolio of assets, we could not just focus on the operating decarbonization. We understand that a more comprehensive approach to decarbonization is achieved when we are considering the full life cycle. In this case, we must track and consider the embodied carbon impact of the interventions defined under the plan, so these interventions can incur in a greater carbon impact than the expected savings from the interventions. So just to avoid going over time, our perspective is driven by what the market will be expecting. Current regulatory requirements are focusing on organizations' actual environmental and social impact, but this is only the first step of the journey. Reporting on progress over your net zero ambitions and commitments is becoming mandatory, and we're also seeing, obviously, from a commercial perspective, tax over carbon generated is aiming to increase in coming years, and the risk of stranded assets is exponential every year we fail to tackle the modernization of our portfolio. Thanks so much, and I'll pass it back to Kate.
Oh, so much, Alex. And there's so much to go at there, but it's really set the scene for us in terms of some of the challenges that you're facing here. But now let's bring in Matt and Jay to talk us through how that methodology actually can respond to some of those challenges.
So thank you, Kate. Yeah, so I just want to make it clear that today the decarbonisation planning methodology is a 6-initiative process, and it describes how you embark on your decarbonisation journey. So during this particular section of the webinar, we want to guide you through the fundamentals of each initiative. And what we're going to do is we're going to complement that with a supporting use case from the work that we've undertaken with Alex and Brookfield Asset Management. So to start with, I want to point out that this is not a linear process, okay? So what you see on the previous slide was what appeared to be a linear 6-initiative process. However, this isn't just a process that is undertaken just once. It's iterative. It's a cyclical process with multiple points of entry and feedback loops. And that depends on where you currently reside on your decarbonisation journey. And I think from the results on the poll, it's very clear that we're all at different stages, okay? And this is why this methodology is so relevant, is because you can start and enter at different points. And the fact that we're living in an ever-increasing complex world, we've got constantly changing regulations and standards, means that we cannot stand still. And we need to constantly reevaluate that journey and roadmap of your way to net zero. So ESG reporting and disclosure is here to stay, and I think Alex has already alluded to that, with new and emerging standards appearing every year. So now is the time to decipher what they are and how they relate to your portfolio targets. So if we start with Initiative 1, okay, so Initiative 1 aims to help you and all of your key stakeholders to identify the key drivers to establishing what we call a bottom-up program, but that's aligned with top-down goals. And what this does, it provides agency across all layers of your organization to understand what good looks like, whilst enabling clear visibility of performance across the entire organization. So my first question to you really, Alex, is, in a large company like Brookfield Asset Management that has numerous portfolio funds, and obviously we're talking about BPREP on this particular white paper, how are decarbonisation targets set for each fund, and how do they relate to the overall strategy?
Yeah, good question, Matt. So setting targets at the Brookfield level is a challenge. as we invest in different type of markets and hold such a variety of assets, we had to set up targets that could be achievable across the board. So as such, we have adopted more of a dual approach here. So Brookfield has formalized more high-level targets, such as achieving net zero by 2050 and a 33% reduction of emissions in the portfolio by 2030. And then obviously at our portfolio company levels, at our investment levels, they have set up their specific targets tailored to their assets that must align to the Brookfield targets. So during the holding period of the investment, we continue to monitor these targets through ongoing reporting and data management, and we ensure that decarbonization plans are defined in line with both Brookfield and portfolio companies' targets. That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Thank you, Alex. It goes to show the complexities involved. It's obviously not a one-size-fits-all, but wherever you are in the world and which region you're in. So if we now move on to initiatives 2 and 3, okay, so this is really now about the data. It's all about the data. So we all know we cannot improve what we cannot measure. It's not a new term, but I think it's very relevant in this case. And initiatives 2 and 3 help you to understand what data you need to achieve your performance and ESG targets. And this is where you need a structured approach to data capture, data storage, and also data visibility. So creating what we refer to as a data responsibility matrix that clearly conveys the how, the what, and the who data you need to capture to provide meaning and context against your goals is a win for pretty much any organization that's listening on this call. So knowing which stakeholders and departments are responsible for which data type and outcomes, it provides clarity and context against the set targets that we refer to in Initiative 1. So the next step really is to ensure that you align external data aggregator reporting rules to your own internal data types, such as asset location, billing parameters, power quality, just to name 3. But you can see on the screen there's a whole host of other data types that we should be considering and looking at as part of this initial exercise. If you have access to structured data, I think that you're required to report against. It makes all stakeholders within your organization, it makes them have the ability to access it and see how they're performing against their own targets. Okay, so we know there's a lot of silo vertical data structures within organization. Every assets have different types of structure in an Excel sheet, on paper, in databases. And this is where a cloud-based analytical and reporting tool really provides a huge advantage. And this permits stakeholders at all levels to delve into their own domains, but also conceptualizes how their organization is performing as a whole. And that's where we went back to the previous diagram. You can see that there's various layers of organization that need access, both top down and bottom up. As a real advantage, this is where agency comes into its own. Okay, you're empowering your stakeholders to take responsibility and ownership. So my next question to you, Alex, is what specific data challenges have Brookfield dealt with when acquiring existing building portfolios as part of funds?
Yeah, well, there are a number of challenges. I think I briefly mentioned a couple of them in the initial remarks. I guess the key challenges have always been the availability on data, especially tenant data and tenant control data. The biggest challenge we have with residential assets, for example, where families are in charge of their energy contracts and the European regulation on data protection, these allow us to meter it ourselves without the tenant consent, right? We similarly had issues collecting waste data as well, because when managed by local councils, boroughs that do not track and estimate that data, we face a wall in terms of obtaining that data. And then one of the key challenges we've noticed when acquiring a new portfolio, if that is going to be externally managed by an external property manager, we face issues where they have historically not been collecting the data on a timely basis. And so the way we have been able to tackle this is through specific clauses in our property management, specific clauses on the property management agreements, so we can obviously force our property managers to provide that data.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alex. And I think it's key. We've discussed this at length, but data. We absolutely need to understand what that baseline is, what we've currently got as an as-is scenario, and then where we want to get to. We can then look at those data types and understand what is a more efficient and effective way of capturing that data. So hopefully everyone's sort of come away from that knowing that the first 3 initiatives are really around the why, what are we trying to achieve, and then what data do we need to achieve that. So at this point, thank you very much for that, Alex. I'm going to hand over to Jay now, who's going to take us through the final three initiatives, 4, 5, and 6.
Right, thanks, Matt. So as Matt said, the first half of the methodology, the three initiatives, are about identifying your target and then getting the data to help make decisions. The second half is largely about, so what do we do now? What do we do first? What do we do later? And how do we sort of figure out how to start achieving that decarbonization journey? Initiative 4, which I'm going to talk about here for a moment, is to help identify the risks and opportunities across the portfolio and within individual assets. As Alex mentioned, just thinking about the BPREP fund, we had roughly 500 assets within that portfolio. So trying to break that down can be quite overwhelming. The first place to start is to think about those assets as archetypes. And what I mean by an archetype is by a type of building. So in the case of BPREP, as you'll see in the white paper, we had student housing, logistics, commercial office, multifamily residential as archetypes. And by breaking those buildings down into archetypes, and you could even go a step further and break them down into potential years or geographies, whatever makes sense for your particular portfolio, those archetypes allow you to compare like for like a lot more clearly when you're trying to make decisions about what to do. Once you have the archetypes in place, the next step is to start to rank those assets within each archetype against each other. Energy use intensity is a great way to do this, and it's what we've suggested in the white paper as one pathway, because you can normalize against size, obviously, and try to find the dogs within the portfolio that are underperforming against the average and against where you want to get to. It also helps you identify which of those assets are potentially the riskiest from a carbon footprint perspective. Within each archetype, once you know which ones are doing poorly versus good compared against their colleagues, you can also start to identify what sorts of interventions you want to apply to get your carbon footprint down. And again, you're thinking within an archetype. So, picking, for example, multifamily residential, which we go into in some detail in the white paper, thinking about envelope improvements, thinking about electrification, thinking about lighting retrofits. You can start to think about those as sort of prototypical interventions within an archetype. So here we're not really thinking about the asset itself yet, we're thinking at a programmatic level. And once you have both your ranked assets and the types of interventions you want to apply to them, you can start to think about what sorts of interventions are you going to give you the best return on investment, what are going to give you a good impact from a decarbonization perspective, but also what are going to fit well within your cost parameters, what are going to be least disruptive to the tenants. Remember, we're talking about a portfolio here, which is existing, so you likely got tenants within your spaces, and so thinking about what that looks like. And then lastly, thinking about how you might want to sequence those interventions. It might make better sense to do something up front and something later because there's a better return on investment or because it sets you up for a later play. So that sequencing becomes really important. So within initiative number 4, Alex, I'm going to kick this over to you here for a second. How does Brookfield, what is the kind of process you guys go through to identify interventions? And how do you think about them at an asset level, as I've kind of talked through on step 4?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So first thing we do, we analyze the data collected to understand worst performing assets by energy intensity and best performing assets, as you mentioned. So once we understand which are our worst performing assets, we then, using the methodology applied by you and Schneider, we came to understand the potential interventions that can help decarbonize our assets based on the type of building. The following step tackles the analysis across our portfolio to create priority list based on stage of the investment and energy performing ratios. So this requires working closely with the people in our assets. Those are the property managers. So we can understand what has been done in the past and what can and can't be done in the building. No one is closer to a building than the actual property managers, which they spend every day there. So we work with them to understand the implementation of interventions and proceed to get these interventions to the next stage where we need to tender and plan on cost for all of those interventions.
Thank you, Alex. Jumping to the last two, and Alex kind of set this up a little bit. We're now into a stage in initiatives 5 and 6 where we start to think about, well, what are we going to do? What does our roadmap look like? What does our funding model look like? And how are we going to implement this type of a program? So we know what assets potentially have the greatest impact on the carbon footprint on the portfolio. We haven't yet gotten to the place where we've done, Alex mentioned working with the facility management teams for each asset, but we haven't yet gotten to an individual building discussion yet. We haven't sent people out to site to investigate or engineer any specific solution. We're still talking at a portfolio level. And I think that's important to note because Alex mentioned we're talking about how to move here at scale. We're talking about a portfolio program, and it can be quite costly and time consuming to sort of jump straight from establishing targets all the way down to implementing interventions because you've got a lot of buildings. Just simply going out and doing a site assessment of all of them would be quite intensive. So here we're still talking about how do you think about funding and capital improvements and a roadmap at a portfolio level. We want to rank within each of the assets, what's going to give you the greatest impact. I think we're going to talk, and we're going to hear a little bit about this from Alex here when he answers, but what does the asset strategy look like? Where are you in the ownership cycle? What does exit look like? How much capital do you have remaining within that asset hold strategy? Is certainly going to play in. What sort of regulatory impacts does a specific asset or geography of assets potentially have coming down the road that are going to impact them that you need to comply with or report around? And how do you want to procure interventions? It might make sense as you think about capital improvements to bulk buy equipment or implementations across multiple assets at once instead of procuring them out individually on an asset by asset basis. And there could be partnerships that make sense to go in and do this as a sort of holistic portfolio application. Once you've kind of got a prioritization of the sorts of asset implementations you want to do, and you've got sort of a rough roadmap, this is where we're suggesting that you should go in and do some on-site surveys at an individual asset level. By now, you should know which assets you're going to be doing some interventions on in the near term. And now it would make sense to go out, send a team, do that audit, kick the tires, understand the age of the equipment and the individual assets sort of configuration so you know how you're going to work that. And then finally, you need to think about how to prioritize the funding, zooming back out again, against the enterprise goals. So Alex mentioned at the very start, what do Brookfield's enterprise decarbonization commitments look like? And as you think about how you're going to apply a roadmap, what's going to get you to the enterprise level commitment in the timeline that you've aligned? You might think about things like CREM pathways, which again, I think, Alex, you're probably going to address in the question that is coming to you right now, which is, how does Brookfield think about what is an optimum roadmap look like for intervention implementation across a portfolio like BPREP?
Yeah, great question. So for us, an optimum roadmap has to consider different levels of intervention depending on asset efficiency, asset maturity, point in time in the life cycle, as you were mentioning, of the investment, the current business plan, what's in our business plan, and how much can we do. So we would map our portfolio to different roadmaps, and ranging from a lighter touch type of interventions to more significant interventions. And we would also obviously think of aligning with the CREM pathway developed for each asset at the asset level. For those of you who are not familiar with CREM, I think most of you will be, but in case, this is an EU tool that shows the decarbonization curve that your assets should follow until 2050. And if you were to fall outside the curve, your asset would be at risk of stranding. So it is important to us that the mapping exercise happen first at the high scale level, at the whole portfolio level, and face interventions on a holistic basis, and then apply those individually at the asset level whereby we have more capacity to do so, and into the more of greater detail. And we also have defined ESG minimum standards on fit outs for a number of our portfolio companies what we're trying to ensure is that our tenants, whereby come in and do their fit out, are aligned into the interventions that they could do as well from their end. We don't want to jeopardize all of the work done through decarbonization by bringing in a tenant that due to their activity and also their personal preferences would bring interventions that will obviously could be negative wise for across our assets when looking into decarbonization.
So Kate, I think we're going to turn it back to you here to potentially summarize our discussion.
Amazing. Well, I'll try my very best because there's so much to go at there. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Right, yes, so in an attempt to summarize that, if we don't decarbonize our existing buildings, then, you know, we really do impact our future profitability. We really do risk impacting that. I'm hearing that the way to tackle it really is to start with those assets that are easiest to decarbonize. Jay, you talked about bang for buck at one point, I think, and really set your roadmap from there. You said, Jay, getting from what we could do to what we will actually do in terms of that roadmap. And it's that data capture. Alex, you spoke about that as a key challenge. And Matt, you said data, 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 and the monitoring process and stakeholder engagement. All these things really are key. And if we can kind of follow that structure and that methodology, then we can decarbonize efficiently, but whilst minimizing that disruption and maximizing return on investment. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Right, we've got a decent amount of time here for some Q&A. So audience, you should have a questions panel that you can type any questions that you've got for our panel into. And I see that we've got a couple coming through already. So let's have a look. Also, if we don't manage to answer all the questions that we've got here for you, we do promise to get back to you with an answer as well if we run out of time. All right, the first one we've got here is for Alex, and that says, apart from decarbonisation and sticking with your CRREM targets, do you also have a plan to, say, stick with the near-term SBTi science-based targets, wherein, wherein we might say we also want to reduce by 50% by 2030. Is that one you can take, Alex?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think it's a great point. So thanks for that question. We have a number of portfolio companies that have their own SBTi targets defined. Definitely, this is a process, obviously, that we have to factor in. Through our monitoring, we obviously get reported all of their SBTIs and updates to those SBTIs because they're getting updated quite regularly with changes to regulations. So definitely decarbonization has to be also aligned to SBTi targets. If you have much more ambitious targets than what the CRREM tool, the CRREM pathway, or our general decarbonization plans suggest, we need to obviously consider them and make sure that we are making the right implementations to achieve those. The way we keep that monitoring is simple. Is very close relationship with our portfolio companies, making sure that we are continuing to monitor, but also have a helping hand. We work with a big network of advisors and third parties that are there that are doing immense great work, and it's just a matter of targeting it early. Keep collecting data, keep checking that you are reducing year on year your carbon emissions. Timely data, and timely data doesn't mean give me annual timely data, but give me live data. Give me data that shows me as well how can we make our building efficient by operationally. It's not all about let's make interventions from a CapEx perspective, but make changes to your tenants' usage, the way they use it. Teach them, as well as smart building technology is bringing down energy usage and decarbonizing just with very little disruption and very little retrofit. So definitely we have to think on all of that and keep that data tracking live.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, that timely live data and actually the value of just teaching tenants and occupants how to use their buildings and spaces efficiently is a really first protocol. Okay, let's have a look. Well, we've got one for you here, Jay, I think, and anyone else can jump in if they see fit as well. This says, when you say you have a situation wherein me as a property owner have tenants, can we suggest any initiatives or strategies to improve the energy for the things controlled by the tenants, or only me as a landlord? So that kind of dovetails nicely with some of the things that Alex was just saying as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And one that we maybe didn't give as much of a voice to as we probably should have in the white paper, because particularly in the case of commercial real estate, the large bulk of carbon footprint, operational carbon footprint, is going to be your tenants. I think we can probably all agree that this is a partnership between you and your tenants, and understanding what your tenants need, what they've committed to. If potentially we're looking at commercial tenants who might have also made commitments, would be a great place to start. Just picking an example from the BPREP fund, one of the things that I remember discussed as a team within the multifamily residential archetype was to understand what kind of tenants were living in these buildings. And I think even Kate, this might have been something you had suggested on one of our first calls, is, are these multi-generational families? Do you have grandma and grandpa living at home looking to keep the apartment conditioned during the day, or are these largely young couples with no kids who both go to work and the apartment sits empty during the day? That might change the strategy that you would implement in terms of how the buildings are conditioned and where your carbon footprint is actually happening. So maybe to summarize, from my perspective, it's absolutely a partnership. I think if you could look for something where 1 + 1 = 3, where you and your tenants are trying to achieve similar goals. And maybe I'll end by saying, as much as anything, this is a change management challenge as anything else.
Yeah.
Simple signage about, jump in, Matt, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I agree 100%, Joe, and I think this is down to the relationship that you have with your landlord and the tenant. So we know in the digital world that we live in now, a lot of these systems have the capabilities to throw the data out that you need. So when you have that landlord-tenant debate happening, there are cloud-based technologies now that allow you to incorporate the data from landlord systems and put them into the cloud, where if the tenant's worried about security, as an example, and cybersecurity is quite a hot topic at the moment, there are ways that you can share that data. And there's a way that you can understand the building data as a whole that the landlord's obviously responsible for, but as a tenant, sometimes you don't know that you've got access to that data. Sometimes it's very difficult. There's a delineation between landlord and tenant. I think that's changing a lot more now. And certainly what we're seeing with the retrofit market is, how can we get that data uncovered and shared in a very secure way that will allow tenants, to Jay's point, to really understand how their floor or how their part of the building is being utilized. So that is definitely one point I'd like to make, is that there are systems out there now, solutions, tools, software packages, call them what you want, that will bring all this together to allow that, contextualization of that data. And certainly when you're talking about BMS, mechanical systems, fan coil units, lighting, this is where those key, easy to reach savings can be made. And I think that's something we should be, not too scared to ask. Ask your landlord, what data is available. It might be that that data is available, it's just not switched on, it's just not enabled. And I've seen that in quite a few instances. So, don't be afraid to ask.
Brilliant, thanks both. And yeah, Jay, isn't there some interesting conversations we were having actually around, behind this data is actually a load of human behaviors and actions and preferences that's reflected back to us in that data. And actually sometimes the starting point is really getting a better understanding of that. Super. Right, we've got lots of good questions coming in here. Alex, this one is one for you, I think. It says, good morning, this is Andy from the US, Kentucky. What challenges did you have with the actual accounting of the CO2? What management platform are you using?
That's a great question, actually. Definitely one that I can answer. So from our point of view, again, just because of size, we obviously had to use a third-party tool with a third-party advisor. I'm not going to share all of that data because I guess there are lots out there that can help. But what I would say is we have one for the whole of Brookfield real estate portfolio globally, where we collect all of the data from energy usage, water, and waste from all of our portfolio companies. All of them have to input the data there. The way they do it, many of our portfolio companies have already their own EMS or energy management system in place where they've been collecting data from the past because they're quite mature businesses that focused on sustainability at the earlier stage, or they've just started engaging with new tools that they're out there. They're becoming more and more powerful, and definitely you will need one of those to keep track of all of your data. And based on that third party that provide the tool are also making the calculations on carbon emissions. Now, one very important thing we did, and I actually recommend everyone, is to define your methodology for calculation. So your third party advisor will provide you with their preferred methodology. However, this not yet unified the way we're going to factor certain scopes. So I'll give you an example. Is tenant controlled data or tenant data? If the energy usage from a tenant on a tenant area, even if it's landlord controlled or tenant controlled, do we think that data should be scope 3 or not, right? If you like, the basis would say anything that a tenant controls would be scope 3, but if it's the landlord controlled, where do we factor that in? Well, that is a decision that you have to make, and it has to be consistent across your portfolio. So it's very important that methodology is defined into certain areas where the line is blurred, and for that you need a third-party advisor to help you out. And once you define your methodology, you work with the third-party advisor and say, hey, this is the way we want to calculate it. We need to make sure this is the way you calculate with the data that you have in the system. So overall, maybe coming a little bit technical there, but definitely use a good software, user-friendly, that allows you to collect the data easily, that is useful for all of your portfolio companies. If you are just a landlord with no portfolio companies, similar, where your property managers can easily put the data and review it and use it themselves, because this is just one of property management. You want to know your energy cost as well, so invoices could go there. So definitely have a good EMS that allows you to track that data, to make the calculations based using the right emission factors and get the right scope.
Brilliant, thanks for that really detailed answer, Alex. I think we'll go to Jay now with a bit more of a broader question here. Does this methodology, or how does this methodology apply to other sectors or end markets, not just commercial real estate?
Well, the short answer is yes. I think the methodology was intended to apply to a broad variety of the built environment. And I think even if you were to look at, say, BPREP-E, the portfolio we looked at on the Brookfield side, a number of those archetypes wouldn't fall into a sort of narrow definition of commercial real estate. So any portfolio of size is going to be messy. You're going to have assets that don't cleanly fit into one particular bucket. So we tried to create a methodology that was extensible to sort of a broad variety of the types of portfolios that our clients would typically have. The other thing that's probably worth noting is there are some markets where we're seeing a lot of movement in decarbonization that this would apply to, I think, just as easily, although I think the targets would look maybe a little different. Aviation being one of them, and healthcare being a second, where we're seeing a high level of maturity in commitments those organizations are making. And I think even though this methodology wasn't specifically tailored for those end markets, the approach would apply. I don't know if the rest of the panelists have anything else to add there.
No, I 100% agree, Jay. I think it's a methodology that can be taken to any building asset, really, because the process remains the same. Okay, you've got to understand why you're trying to achieve this. What are those regulations and targets? And every segment and industry will have differing views, different regulations and standards. But at the end of the day, net zero carbon is where we all want to get to, and we all want to decarbonize. So the methodology lends itself well to that. And I think, Jay, you picked on two great segments there in aviation and healthcare, because healthcare, let's face it, certainly here in the UK, we've got a lot of aging assets and a lot of embodied carbon within them. So it's going to be very difficult to justify knocking them down and building new when we've already expelled that much embodied carbon in there. So again, understanding the baseline of that full whole life cycle carbon assessment, of understanding what the embodied carbon and operational carbon savings are, I absolutely see this as a methodology that we could take to other segments.
And thanks both very much. And yeah, keeping our eye on that whole life cycle carbon, and not just thinking about operational carbon, that is really, really important and something we need to keep coming back to and remembering. Jay, another one for you. Sorry, this is around calculating energy use intensity. Said, when you mentioned calculating energy use intensity, what was the surface area that you used? Do you consider only the conditioned area or the whole building area? And additionally, do you consider a normalized carbon emissions or the total to derive the plan? So quite a specific question there, Jay. Is that one you can take?
It's a specific question, but a good one, because it drills in on the problem that I think any organization is going to have. And I'll kind of give you a picture into the weeds. When we were working with Alex's team on BPRAP, we got a giant spreadsheet of values, right? And there's a column that says square footage or square meterage. And so the first question is, well, what does that represent? And you're dealing at a bench as sort of a desktop level with a bunch of data. And in our case, we didn't know when it said so-and-so square meters or so-and-so square foot. Is that conditioned area? Is that GFA? Is it right? And so earlier you heard us talk a lot about data. I think it's important for any organization to define what are the inputs you're expecting to get and be able to trust those inputs. If you don't trust the square footage, or you're not even sure what units it's in, trying to make decisions off of it is quite complicated. If I was to give you a quick answer, give you the long answer, my take would be conditioned area would be a better metric to use than unconditioned area. There might be assets where that doesn't make sense, but for commercial real estate, probably conditioned. And for normalized carbon footprint, yes, I would suggest normalizing it is a great way to think about how an asset stacks up against its competitors. But also remember, and you'll see this in the white paper, that some very large properties would have a large carbon footprint, operational carbon footprint. And even if they were maybe comparatively good against some of their other peers, a small change in that large building might be more meaningful within the portfolio than a big change in a small building. So yes, normalize your carbon footprint, but also think about the total carbon footprint of each asset when thinking about a roadmap.
Perfect. Thank you, Jay. Really clear answer. I think we've just got time to squeeze one more in here. And there's a really pertinent one that's come in here around the Brown discount and asset valuations. And I think we'll direct this to you, Alex, in the first instance, but everyone else jump in also if you've got anything to add. And the question says, in relation to asset valuations, how is the Brown discount phenomenon factored into the process, especially where regulations like EPC C in 2025 and EPC B in 2030 is the minimum for commercial lets in the UK?
It's a very good question. So I'll take this one. We perform a whole analysis on EPCs under the MEES regulation, obviously stating EPC minimum EPC 2023, C25, and EPC B by 2030. One thing that we realize is for our portfolios that are not there at the C and the B levels, we engage a third party to do an assessment on a asset by asset basis, the assets that were meeting those and understand, you know, what needs to be done to get the asset to a level that would be a EPC B. And based on that, we have factored all of that into the evaluation model. So obviously you do have all of that factored in as a cost that we have to be going through in the next 5 years. So definitely it is factored in as brown discount phenomenon. We not necessarily are incorporating any discount right now on our asset valuations. One thing that we do is we have our internal valuation policy and methodology, which right now doesn't account for it, but definitely we are accounting for all of the OPEX and CAPEX that we need to do to get the asset to the level that it needs to be. So we don't have to be impacted by any type of brown discount.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. Right, we've come to the end, so we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It makes me just feel really excited and hopeful for the future, just to see the level of engagement and the number of participants and the number of questions we've had around this topic. So that's fantastic. If you do want to get more detail on what we've spoken about today, please do download that white paper using the QR code on your screen. And thank you very much for joining us.